All right, Bruce, welcome to the Easy Conversations podcast. Thank you for joining me today. I'm really looking forward to our conversation. We've had the opportunity to connect previously, and I felt we connected on a lot of things, and I'm willing to explore some of that today and see what comes up. Really excited to get into some of that stuff as well. But before we jump into it, I do want to give you an opportunity to share with the listeners a little bit about yourself, who you are, what's brought you here today.
Thanks. I'm delighted to be here. It's great to be on your show. I am a psychologist. I've been in private practice for over 30 years now. And mostly for the past 10, 12 years, I guess, I've focused primarily on couples, mostly because I just enjoy working with couples. I really enjoy it's a great privilege with individuals too. It's a great privilege to be admitted into people's lives that way.
Yes.
There's something about working with couples issues that just feels so immediate and so important. And so anyway, I just really love doing that.
Yeah.
And along the way, I started doing, I don't know, maybe 15 years ago or so, I started doing some videos about my work just because I enjoyed doing that and did a bunch of those and eventually decided, oh, I think I have a book here. So I wrote a book, my first book, and that has led to two more since then. So I have three books out now on couples therapy issues. And also along the way, that first book came out. The date of the first book emerging happened to be February 29th, 2020, that leap day of 2020.
Hmm.
What a great time to launch a book when all of a sudden everything shut down for the pandemic and there was no way to do any sort of in public event. My wife and I decided we'll do a Facebook Live, and that led us. We had so much fun doing that. We decided we do a podcast, so I do that as well. So we have a podcast called Couples Therapy in 7 Words, which is based around a sort of motto I came up with many years ago that sort of encapsulates a lot of what couples therapy is about.
Hmm.
And we've interviewed all kinds of really interesting folks and had a lot of fun doing it.
Yeah, that's awesome. Thank you for sharing all that. And it's interesting you mentioned that it is a privilege when we get this opportunity to work with people because I do feel that as well. And I consider it a gift because there's that opportunity to get insight into what people are struggling with and the fact that they're trusting you with this eh, information, but then also have that opportunity to guide others however we feel compelled in our field. So it's really important to highlight that. But I'm also curious to understand because you said you've been in the field for over 30 years. How have you seen it evolve? Because I think mental health has become something really important, especially in the last decade or even 15 years, I would say, where there's a lot more emphasis on it. But I'm also seeing anything in that space where you put so much focus on it, it can also go too far in many
Mm-hmm.
ways. So I wonder if that's something you've also observed in your experience over time.
Yeah, interesting question. I mean, I've certainly seen a lot of evolution. It's hard for me to tease out how much of it is just my own experience. I think I've got better at it over the years. I know there's various situations I think I'm less freaked out about than I used to be, so it's easier for me to be a little graceful in handling situations. And I think I've seen some sort of societal change around what it's okay to talk about or not talk about. That kind of stuff has changed. In terms of the field itself, sometimes going to excess, that's probably always been true. I'm thinking about some of my early training in family therapy where people were paying homage to this, to some techniques that we can now look back on as rather cringeworthy. It's, oh my God, we thought that back then, that kind of thing. I think that's inevitable in any sort of field. I think another thing that's happened with mental health, which again, I guess has an upside and a downside, there's less stigma associated with going to a therapist than there was at one time. I'm remembering in my early days and training days, and I would go to older colleagues and they would make sure that their waiting rooms had an entry and then they'd have a separate exit from their offices so nobody would ever encounter each other. That seems to have gone away
Mm.
largely. And that's a good thing. But then there's this tendency for everything to become medicalized or everything becomes a diagnosis
Yes.
as opposed to I remember the big reaction to that back in the 1960s. Thomas Zotz, I think I'm pronouncing his name correctly, he wrote a book called The Myth of Mental Illness, which again I think went way too far, but he was making a point. It's like, yes, everything is mental illness? Can't you just have some problems in living, as he would talk about?
Yeah.
And I think he has a point, and I think something similar is happening now. There's so many, everybody now is neurodivergent, for example. There's no such thing as simply not being good at something. So I suck at drawing. Does that mean I'm neurodivergent? I don't know. I suck worse than most people suck at drawing, I think. I don't know. I'm good at some other stuff. I'm whatever. Not everything has to attract a diagnosis, and there is that tendency that everything
Yeah.
wants a diagnosis.
Yeah. And I definitely see that challenge too, where everything gets pathologized in the sense that I'm feeling certain things or certain things are coming up for me. That must mean that I've got something or I must need to be diagnosed so I can feel that I have an answer to it. Whereas sometimes you just have to deal with life as it may come up.
Yeah.
Now, the other thing with respect to couples work, have you noticed a shift there? Because I would assume, and this is just based on my observation and personal experience too, the challenges are a lot different now than they perhaps were even 2 decades ago when it comes to relationships. What are you seeing in that front? Because I think that will be a good segue into one of the things we also wanted to talk about around the betrayal piece. What are you noticing in your couple's work and what's more at the forefront now that perhaps wasn't there before?
Yeah, yeah. I could start with the song As Time Goes By. You must remember this. A kiss is still a kiss. A lot of stuff stays the same.
Yeah.
People have been cheating on their spouses forever. Now, what has changed around that? First of all, the definition of cheating has changed. There are opportunities for doing things that nobody could even conceive of 30 or 50 or 60 years ago. And so the internet has way changed even the definition of cheating. And then there's the phenomenon that lots of people define cheating differently than they might have at one time. It's only in the past few years I've explicitly asked couples now, is your deal with each other sexual monogamy? I don't assume it anymore. I didn't even realize for a long time I was assuming it. I just assumed it. And then I started encountering folks where if I would ask the question, and it's still overwhelming, the answer to that is yes, by the way. But I started encountering people where they said, well, not exactly. It depends.
Mm.
That's especially true like with gay male couples, for example. And I don't see a lot of gay couples because I'm not gay and quite properly, they'll probably do better going to a gay therapist.
Yes.
But I have done some because, and they know perfectly well that I'm not gay, but nevertheless, I can help them.
Hmm.
And lesbian couples, same things. There are some characteristic differences there.
Yeah.
But in terms of what's happened over time, so that's changed. The existence of the internet has changed. How people get busted for cheating has changed utterly.
Yeah.
Now it's, oh, I saw the text come in, as opposed to I found the receipt for the motel room in your pocket, that sort of thing.
Right.
That's changed. And there's also some interesting changes in the nature of conversations, I think. Again, hard to tease out how much of this is just my own
Yeah.
getting more comfortable with it. Early on, I think it was harder to have conversations that would play with. It's funny, it was easy to play with gender roles 30 years ago in the sense that everybody was questioning everything. There was lots of questioning. I started hearing, or at least noticing, probably 20 years ago at least, I started noticing women in heterosexual couples, women would often say, and these are very often they are like feminist women who are very much into making sure that things are fair and equal and they don't want to feel oppressed and all of those things that make a lot of sense to me. And they would start saying, what happened to the guys?
Mm.
I want him to be the guy. I don't want him to be a jerk,
Mm.
but I want him sometimes to take the lead and he doesn't seem to know how to do it.
Mm.
So it seems like, and various people have addressed this in various ways, young men these days don't seem to know how to impress a young woman. Even the concept of impressing a young woman seems odd. And young women are wondering, why are the guys so generally, and this is a stereotype, of course, but why are the guys so generally aimless? Why don't they seem like they want to accomplish something? Here comes an old person comment, and for people who can't see me, I can report. I'm an old guy. I'm in the States carrying a Medicare card. That makes me officially old. I'm in my 70s. And so I remember back in the day, if you wanted to impress a girl as a high school boy,
Mm.
and this sounds even older than my generation, you had to have prospects.
Yes.
You had to seem like you could maybe support a family because even then the general norm was the guy's going to be making the money while the woman's having babies, even though yes, by my generation, of course, women generally were employed way more than my mother's generation,
Mhm.
but outside the home. But the still a idea was, well, of course, the father's mostly going to make the money to support the family because that's how it works. Is the women are the ones who have babies and raise them. Those could be rigid and painful strictures for people, but it's just fascinating to me over the years how I've heard from many people who have many women who are earning a lot more than their
Yeah.
husbands are, and therefore the husbands are the ones staying home, and the women are saying, I didn't think I would feel this way, but I resent the hell out of it.
Mm,
I didn't want to have babies and let my husband raise them.
mm.
And so that's interesting. That's the kind of thing that would have been harder to talk about for a lot of folks, I think, 25, 30 years ago than it is now. It's the people are willing to question some of the assumptions of whatever the current zeitgeist is.
Yeah. Yeah. And so do you think that's an aspect of biology coming into play where women are like, yeah, as much as I was driven to have this career and seek it out, inherently it doesn't feel good. And that's where that resentment is coming up. Is it a biology that we perhaps dismissed on with this move?
Yeah. And with, of course, the proviso that it doesn't apply to everybody.
Right.
There's some, but yes, there are lots and lots. Just that idea that there are characteristic differences between men and women. They don't apply to every individual the same way, of course. But
Yes.
there are some pretty large characteristic average differences between men and women in things like attitude, in things like what sort of thing you want to be spending your time doing and what's important to you. And to ignore those things as we were trained to do early on. By getting my training back, I grew up in the 1950s and 60s and became an adult in the 70s. And you questioned all those things.
Yeah.
And I understand why. We were throwing out an awful lot of baby with the bathwater
Yes.
and ignoring those characteristic differences.
Yeah.
So I'm often asking about that stuff, and people don't always realize it unless they're willing to actually question their assumptions.
Yes. Yeah. And I think it's important. It's good to hear that the couples are coming to you and having that willingness to explore those things because a lot of the times what I see is that resentment just breeds in silence. And then unfortunately, the relationship ends up ending, or even if they're together, they're not really happy together and they're not trying to solve those problems. So that's good. But there's another aspect that you touched on, I do want to explore further is this whole notion of men lacking, not really having what I would say a purpose in life, and then not even knowing how to approach women. How much of it is societal based where there's so much fear for men around? Because I hear different aspects to the argument that I don't know how to approach a woman because there's online dating apps. I don't get out. I'm playing video games. There's so many different layers to it. But then there's the other side is I don't know what's appropriate anymore and what's not. Whereas what I saw growing up, a lot of the times the interaction was fueled based on alcohol. In retrospect, sometimes it could have been inappropriate or even abusive in a way. So there's that fear as well. How much of that plays into all of this? I know I'm throwing many into,
Yeah,
but yeah,
all of the above. To the first one you mentioned about people, I sound like an old guy again, don't I? Kids these days, but they spend so much time in the virtual world.
yes,
They don't spend that much time actually relating to other human beings, and it's scary. And so, to that extent, they don't know how to interact. They don't know how to actually approach someone or interact in real time. And there is such an enormous amount of focus on whether or not you've been injured. And this is true across many different domains. The focus on the concept of a microaggression, which is I think, a really important concept. I'm not saying it's a bad idea, but you can focus on microaggressions to such an extent that it renders people. Who I'm channeling right now is Greg Lukianis and Jonathan Haidt. Do you know those names?
I know,
Yeah,
John.
and Jonathan Haidt. Yeah, he's one of my favorite authors
Yeah,
actually, and he co-wrote a book with Greg. I think I'm pronouncing it right. Greg Lukianis. What was it called? The Something of the American Mind. Some negative term. I forgot what it was, but what it's talking about is rendering people, instead of rendering people resilient, it's rendering them fragile.
yeah,
And he talks about ways of making people anti-fragile. The way you make people anti-fragile is by getting exposed to getting
yeah,
bumped around and being okay. That's how you learn to do it. And the focus on protecting people from the slightest bit of insult,
yeah. Mm,
it gives rise to these phenomena on college campuses where people think that if they hear an opinion that they don't like, they've been wounded.
Mm,
It's like they've been abused, as opposed to, oh, you hear an opinion you don't like, go ahead and argue with it or reject it or something.
right.
But you're in college to be challenged, aren't you? But apparently not. And so that's been part of the story. So there's that. And then, of course, the issues again, it's a pendulum swing. It so makes sense to me that women as a group, and I obviously can't, I'm not about to mansplain to women, but sure, it certainly makes sense to me as a heterosexual male. It makes sense to me that women as a group would be mightily pissed off when they stop and consider all those, you could say microaggressions or sometimes not so micro,
Right.
that they have been subject to. And they finally get pissed off and say, enough of this is crazy. Totally makes sense. And then the pendulum swings to such an extent that men don't know how to behave toward women and women don't know how to behave toward men. And that's what gives rise to those women I was talking about before. And again, I'm not sure what your language code is on this podcast. Can I
Girl.
let, okay, good. I have had women, again, we're talking about strong feminist type minded women who would say, I wish he wouldn't be so nice. I wish he would just fuck me. In other words, I want him to take me. I like that. And he's afraid to do it. He's like afraid of her because he's afraid that he doesn't want to be one of those horribly abusive guys. I get that. It's yes, we shouldn't be rapists. Absolutely. We should be, of course, sensitive and respectful. But it turns out if you actually listen, there are some women who say, yeah, but I actually want you to take the lead.
Hmm.
Meaning, I want you to show up and be the guy and take me for what you want me, obviously, with respect to what, if I say no, it means no, of course.
Right.
But go for it, dude. Don't just sit there
Yeah.
or don't just wait for me to, I have to be in charge of everything. There are a lot of people who don't like that. So just to let that be speakable is difficult for a
Yeah.
lot of folks.
Yeah.
So there's a lot of
Yeah.
there's a lot of features to that.
For sure. And I appreciate that. And I think part of it is also the gray areas where I did touch on alcohol that facilitates sometimes those interactions where the individual may have not said yes, but they also didn't say no. It's that consent piece that can be so tricky where I can appreciate it in a relationship, it's different. So when you're working with couples there where there's that fear or it's not the man perhaps isn't taking the lead, especially in a heterosexual relationship, how are you helping them navigate that? Because that could be very difficult, right?
Oh yeah,
For individuals.
yeah.
Yeah.
I certainly don't want to say that consent isn't important. Consent is hugely important. Of
Yes.
course it is. I'm going to introduce a sort of even more general concept here, which I just happen to have done a little short take on this on our podcast. There's the dreaded disease of hardening of the categories.
Mm,
I looked it up and somebody had actually coined a term for it. They called it psychosclerosis. Hardening of the categories. And consent is such a great example of that. It's a really important idea. But if you take it to an extreme, and I've seen this in some, not for the past year or two, I think, but I've seen it in some TV dramas, that kind of thing, where they'll constantly be asking other, is this okay what we're doing? They'll constantly be into that. And there's something about it that just feels icky. Again, consent is super important. I'm not saying it isn't,
right.
but do you really want to talk that way? Is that how people really want to interact? Not generally.
Mhm.
So, yes, that phenomenon that violations of consent are horrendous. Rape is a terrible thing. But there's also got to be room to soften the categories a little bit so people aren't so freaked out about it.
Mhm.
And that's so you ask, how do I approach that with couples? It's always through that general lens of how do you soften the categories? You do it with curiosity. It's like, that's interesting as opposed to, oh my God, that's terrible. Even if it might be terrible, it's terrible, but let's start from the assumption that everybody in this conversation, including me, none of us is crazy. We're not batshit crazy. We're not evil fundamentally. How many folks over 30 years have I met that I'm thinking, oh, I see the problem. You're just an asshole? Not very many. We can all be assholes occasionally, but mostly not, or at least we don't intend to be mostly.
Mm,
So if we start with that assumption, then if somebody has done something bad or that's had a bad effect, yeah, you can freak out about it, or you can also look at it and say, yeah, but you did do that and you're not crazy and you're not evil either. So
mm,
there's probably something important there, even if you quite appropriately regret having done it.
right.
And that betrayal is all about that. People who cheat on their in a monogamous relationship. It is very rare in my office that actually, you know what? I'm going to change the beginning of that sentence because it isn't that rare. Usually, let me put it that way. Usually everybody agrees that it was wrong. Do you know what I mean? Occasionally, the reason I had to change the beginning is occasionally there are folks who say that wasn't really cheating. They'll argue about whether something was really cheating.
Mm,
But often, when it was obviously cheating and there's no question, it's come on, dude, it was a monogamous relationship. You agreed on that and you had sex with somebody else.
right.
There's they're not arguing that. By the time they get to my office, they're not saying, I thought we could do that. Nah, no, you didn't.
Hmm.
So they're all agreeing it was wrong. So if they start off by saying, if the one who did it starts off by saying, oh my God, that was terrible. I must have been crazy. I'll never do it again.
Mm,
That's not terribly helpful
right.
because if you were crazy, you have another problem. Then you can't really be trusted to not, boy, you better get on medication or something. You better not be crazy. But
Mm,
it almost all the time, they're not crazy. It's not because they were crazy. It's not, if they were having a manic episode, that's crazy. Fair enough.
mhm.
It's almost never that. Maybe they were drunk, which lowered their inhibitions, but even that isn't crazy.
Yeah,
It's like you were drunk and you cheated. If you really didn't want to cheat, you probably wouldn't have cheated even if you were drunk. Now, I don't know. Maybe different people respond different ways.
for sure.
And besides, what you let yourself get drunk for and then cheat. Let's okay. You're still responsible for it. What was going on? There's something there. And often when you can look at it with curiosity and more, even more, if the person who is cheated on can get past their initial rage and shock and pain and disorientation and everything else, if they can look at it and say, okay, what was going on? Then they can sometimes really get somewhere. It's, oh my God, I see what's going on here. We had a real lack of intimacy that neither one of us was willing to talk about. Or maybe we shouldn't be together because we're really not compatible, are we? Or whatever it might turn into. But that's how you soften the categories. You
Yeah.
do it with curiosity and not freaking out.
Yeah. Yeah, for sure. And I do want to dive into betrayal and ultimately the forgiveness piece. A lot of people really struggle with the forgiveness side of it, right?
Yeah.
But around betrayal, how do you address using the cheating where when it comes to sex with someone? That's obvious. But there are certain gray areas where there could be the emotional cheating, where they're going out of your relationship and opening up about certain things, which you can argue may or may not be cheating. And that can also be subjective from couple to couple. How do you address those issues where one partner may feel that they've been betrayed, but the other one didn't see anything wrong with it?
Yeah.
How do you navigate those gray areas?
In a sense, it's a similar process. It's you invite curiosity because it's certainly possible, and I've seen this happen, not that rarely, where someone will say, "Look, I hear you. I understand you don't think it was cheating, but I can't wrap my brain around staying married to you after you did that." And that's in my opinion, a perfectly legitimate stance. It means they end up breaking up, and that I think I respect someone's right, and I think it's a good thing that they can say that if they want to. Often it's about looking at that more carefully and saying, I don't know if I can trust you again. I don't know if I can forgive you. And I use the word forgiveness in a particular way. Forgiveness to me doesn't mean imply that you're going to trust someone. Forgiveness is, to use someone else's phrase, it's an inside job. In other words, forgiveness is about letting go of the anger yourself. It's about letting go of the obsession. So then you can think clearly. So if somebody can get to that point and saying, okay, you know what, I can let go of just being angry at you because people do stuff. I know what it feels like to do stuff that maybe I shouldn't have done because that's what I came up with at the moment. I can let go of that. I don't know if I can trust you again, but if I could understand what this is about, maybe I could. And that's about, again, exploring with curiosity. So if you say, gee, what was going on there? And it's so interesting in those situations of cheating. There's a zillion reasons why people cheat. Sometimes there's an element there of saying fuck you to your spouse. You're going to be mean to me. I'll show you. Now, again, usually not quite that conscious, but there's a piece of that. If there's some anger there, and people will sometimes say, yeah, there's probably a piece of that. Sometimes it's more about despair. It's about saying, I we can never connect and I just am so hungry for connection and this person was offering me that and I didn't resist it.
Hmm.
And to when people come to understand that, sometimes they can reconnect. Sometimes they can, and the other person can sometimes say, "Oh my God, I didn't realize that's how you felt. I was feeling the same way, but I didn't know how to talk to you about
Yeah.
it." And they can find each other.
Yeah. Yeah. And this may sound insensitive, but I think biggest thing I've realized is even for the person who's been cheated on, I think part of the struggle is they take it so personally, but it's not. really about them. It's about where the other person was and why they chose to go outside of the marriage, whatever that looks like. Is that a fair conclusion? And when people are able to get to that point, does that help the forgiveness
Oh,
process?
yeah.
Yeah.
Particularly when they get to that point of saying, oh, this wasn't really all about me, was it? There's a good example of that sort of falls in that gray area of is it cheating or not? And it's porn. It's the use of porn. A lot and very much gendered, not exclusively, but almost always when the ones objecting to it are women and the ones saying, what are you objecting to? It has nothing to do with you, we're men. And it is hard for women. And I think there's an element here, speaking of biology, I've often wondered in evolutionary terms, I
Hmm.
think there's an element of evolution here where women are, quote unquote, supposed to take that personally.
Hmm.
It's, oh, if he goes and impregnates someone else, it must be because I'm not good enough. There's some evolutionary imperative at work
Right.
there that they're fighting with. It's unfair, if you ask me, but evolution is not fair. So there's that piece. But often it's such a surprise to women, to those women, when the man is saying this had because she's thinking, weren't you why weren't you thinking? Didn't you realize how much this would hurt me? And the guy was saying, this has nothing to do with you.
Mm.
This is simply nothing. I'm not in love with that image. It just I look at an image like that and it makes me horny, or it turns me on, or it makes me get off, or
Right.
whatever. And so sometimes coming to understand that is very helpful in,
Yeah.
again, I keep using that term, softening the categories. It's, oh, she can say, oh, I guess it really wasn't cheating, was it? Even though I don't like it, I don't like thinking about it. So sometimes the woman will come around to say, I'd rather not hear about it, but I get it. Sometimes the woman will come around to say, all right, let's try it together and maybe I'd be into it too. And sometimes she is. And it's interesting because sometimes they do it together, but she's still offended if he does it by himself.
Right.
So there's all kinds of variations
Yeah.
on that
Yeah.
piece.
And that's where the lines could get blurred. But this is a tough one, right? The porn piece is definitely a gray area because you can make the case that how's it any different than going outside of the marriage? So I
Yeah.
definitely appreciate that piece around it being extremely gray. But there's this other area where, and again, I don't know if it's gender specific, but if you do go outside of the marriage and you have a same sex encounter, have the same level of blow as if it were opposite sex. So I wonder
Yeah.
how you
Yeah.
navigate that piece because depending on the circumstances, one can take that even more personally or less. So that again blurs the lines a little bit.
Yeah, that is a very common occurrence. And I don't mind saying, because I've said this in public before, I'm in a second marriage. The short story of my first marriage was that both my ex and I went on to marry really wonderful women, and we're both a lot happier. That's what happened. So in our case, it wasn't my ex figuring out that she's gay, basically. She's lesbian. Her figuring that out meant that we weren't going to stay married because it
Yep.
just wasn't going to work. And it explained a lot of stuff that with a much better explanation than any other that we had,
Mhm.
which were bad. The other explanations of a situation like that is either she's broken or I'm repulsive. And neither one of those is true. She's not
Mhm.
broken and I'm not repulsive. So
Yeah.
that was really nice.
Yeah.
As they say, we went on to marry lovely women and we're both a lot happier.
Yeah.
So that's a very common, say, I have personal experience of it. That's a very common phenomenon that it's interesting when you say you can take that either way, because I have talked with lots of other people who've been through similar things. And some of them are just, yeah, they're mortally offended because they feel like they can't compete.
Hmm.
I can't compete with a woman or I can't compete with a man or whatever that would be. And it just feels like they feel helpless about it. And at least from my own personal experience, when you can get past that, when you can feel like, oh, it isn't about a deficiency, it just means you were two good people that turned out not to be right for each other to try to be in a sexual relationship. That can soften up a lot. But
Yeah.
that does take, it takes a lot of healing. It takes, it, anytime somebody has betrayed you in some way, whether you'd call it immoral or just circumstantial, anytime that happens, it takes some time to get back on your own feet and recognize that, oh, I'm still a valid person, aren't I? And I always have been. And so were they, by the way. And when you can get there, again, that's what I mean by forgiveness, when you can have that sense of, oh, I guess I can forgive myself, I can forgive whoever hurt me.
Mhm.
I talk in my book, actually, my book on betrayal and forgiveness, about three steps to forgiveness. So I
Yeah.
just alluded to two of them.
Yeah.
The first step is always forgiving yourself, because we always blame ourselves partly for not detecting it or not stopping it or whatever. The second is to forgive whoever hurt you, which is a pretty short step, because you can recognize, oh shit, they were just doing the best they could too. And then the third step I call forgiving God, which is, you don't have to be conventionally religious to appreciate that concept. It's somehow forgiving the fact that we live in a world where that sort of stuff happens and we can't prevent it all the time. And so accepting the rightness of that's, yeah, this damn free will business. It's like you're going to get hurt sometimes
Yes.
with the best of intentions, and
Yeah.
you better accept that's the case, and then you can move on.
Yeah. And it's interesting because I'm hearing like there's two things coming to me as you share those three steps. One is that compassion, not only for yourself, but the other person, in the sense that, okay, everyone's doing the best they can, and you can't really beat anyone up. But then there's this other piece that's really stuck with me because I work in the addiction space. And one of the steps in 12 steps is reminding yourself that God is doing for me what I couldn't do for myself.
Mm.
And that's what I'm hearing in that third step from you, is having that forgiveness and acceptance for that's how the world works sometimes. And sometimes these things are happening for us. And it can be so tough to get out of that if we're so stuck in that resentment and anger and pain that you're not
Yeah.
able to see it. I know in your case too, there's a little bit of humor there, but it sounds like there's also acceptance that things did work out for the best,
Yeah.
right? But not everyone can get there. And sometimes you just need to have that patience and belief in the process itself, as cliche as it sounds. But how do you get people to start thinking about it that way, that maybe this is happening for me, whether I decide to stay with this person and we figure things out, or we decide to go in separate ways and find new partners or new ways of being in life? How do you get
Yeah.
people to that step?
Let me introduce a word which is in my, I always said couples therapy in 7 words, our motto, and the last word is faith. The 7 words are be kind, don't panic, and have faith. And they're in that order because be kind, which is to say, be kin to your partner. You can't do that if you're in a panic. And the solution to panic is faith. What you were just outlining was, I would say, fits under the general heading of faith.
Yes.
That reality is right to be what it is, even when we can't understand it all. And we can't understand it all. We don't have a sort of comprehensive view of the universe. We've only got what we've got. So that basic idea that says, yeah, there's some rightness here, even if I can't sense what it is. Manifesting that, in effect, your question is, yeah, how do I invite people to adopt that sense of faith, to practice that sense of faith? And my answer to that is, I do it. First of all, I use the word practice. It's a practice, it's not a knowledge. Do you know what I mean? It's not, you can't convince someone to have faith, I don't think.
Right.
It's not something that you can't prove it. There's because it's not a provable hypothesis. To say that reality is right to be what it is a value judgment. I can cite all kinds of evidence for how fucked up things are, and I can cite all kinds of evidence for how wonderful things are, and pays your money and takes your choice. So it none of it's provable. It's you're adopting a mindset. So how does one adopt that mindset? You do it by practicing it, and that's a bit of a leap of faith itself. And the way I encourage people to at least consider that is by modeling it. That's the one thing therapists have to offer, I think, if I was going to say it in one word, is faith.
Hmm.
Simply that faith, that if I'm really coming from that aspect that says there's got to be some rightness in here. When I was talking before about curiosity,
Yeah.
that's coming from that attitude. Just the basic premise when I said earlier is none of us is crazy in this conversation. That's a statement of faith.
Hmm.
You're not crazy, you're not evil, you're not stupid. So you're doing stuff that feels bad,
Yes.
but there's something to it. Even if let's all agree it was morally wrong, and I'm not discounting morality as an important thing. I'm just saying, yeah, but you did do those things, so I'll bet there was something important about it. And if we can really understand that and accept, there's your, for the person trying to trust somebody, there's your sense that maybe you can trust them again. Is, oh, geez, we understand this in ways we never did before. We have now learned things we're not going to unlearn. And so it won't unfold the same way. If we bump into intimacy problems in the future, we're going to talk about them rather than somebody acting out.
Yeah. Yeah.
And it's not because somebody's resolved to it, it's because we've learned stuff. When you learn stuff, you don't unlearn it usually.
For sure. And one of the things I've played around with in my head is this whole idea of a self-fulfilling prophecy too, right? Like when someone is about their partner cheating on them or being unfaithful, often they drive them to that because
Yeah,
of how they're showing up in the relationship. And that could be really hard for people to hear or even wrap their head around because it's how am I driving it? It's the way you show up. If you're being
yeah.
insecure, if you're being jealous, you could be pushing your partner in that direction. So the idea that I'm trying to present here is bringing it back to yourself. Who are you? How grounded are you? How centered are you? How are you showing up in the relationship? Are you being the type of person that your partner will adore and be attracted to? Or are you being someone that's pushing them away? How does that play into some of the work you do with couples? And do you see some aspects of that self fulfilling prophecy playing out as
Oh
well?
yeah, yeah. It's always it, I'll call it interesting, but a very tricky part of doing the work, especially early on when you're establishing all of the stuff I've just been saying about there's something important about it, even though what you did was really bad. It's really a fine line, and certainly as far as the person who was cheated on is hearing it, it's a really fine line between that and offering an excuse. It's like you're just offering excuses for his doing something terrible, and he shouldn't have done that. Yes, we've all agreed he shouldn't have done it, and I get that feeling. It's you're going to ask me to consider how was I contributing to his being an asshole, and it's a tough one. That said, of course, everything you said is right. Yeah, isn't that interesting? When you're suspicious all the time or just negative all the time, it shouldn't be surprising that your partner wasn't terribly interested in hanging out with you.
Mm,
And yes, clearly morally wrong, but not surprising that then your partner was susceptible to someone else's attentions.
mhm.
Again, I'm not excusing it, but there is context, and that's the distinction I'll often try to make. Is no, we there's no way we should offer excuses, but
Right,
we do have to consider the context, and you were both part of the context.
right.
I don't usually. It's funny. I'm not deliberately avoiding those words in a first session, but they don't usually come out.
Yes.
It's not how I'm thinking in a first session. In a and of course, people vary with how far along they are in recovering from finding out about it. But if it's relatively early on, that sort of conversation usually takes a few sessions before that starts to emerge.
Mhm.
Because it doesn't do any good as a therapist, doesn't do any good to lose people.
No,
It doesn't do any good to invite people to where they just are not ready to go. And I don't mean to be presumptuous about I know when that is. I don't. You follow the conversation where it seems, yeah, it's here's yet another way of describing the process that from a therapist's perspective, you follow the conversation where the life is.
mhm.
You try to you sniff out where the life is,
Yes.
and you can tell when it's there. It's like people are engaged. It's often uncomfortable. Tolerating anxiety is a huge part of the deal, but you follow that to those intimate moments. Intimacy always involves tolerating
Yeah.
anxiety.
Yeah.
That's what it's about.
You know, what I've observed is often people are revealing themselves even in the mundane details, and it's our job as the therapist to pick up on some of those minor details,
Hmm.
right? And that can lead you to the source of what the issue might be. Now, this is probably a good time to go into the other piece we wanted to talk about, and we touched on it briefly earlier when it comes to relationships or even therapy, the access to information we have, which is obviously causing a lot of issues in monogamy as well, and people being distracted outside of their relationship. But it's also given us access to understanding a lot of the disorders and behavioral and personality traits where it's good to have information. But what I also see in therapy in general, whether it's individual based or with couples, a lot of this knowledge then gets weaponized, right?
You
Where
bet.
one partner does some research and all of a sudden they're an expert and they're diagnosing their partner as narcissistic or abusive. And that to me in itself is abuse in a way. It's hard for people to hear that. And they've all immediately they have the answer to their problem. And then they're going for individual counseling and they're presenting this information to their therapist who's validating them, which is further propagating the issue. I see this a lot. And then sometimes, whether it's the man or the woman, they feel like they're at a loss because now they're being told their partner's therapist even agrees with them. I'm
Yeah.
giving very specific examples, but the nuance there is really important to touch on.
Yeah. Yeah. That is a very common trend. It's I'm trying to think. It seems to me I used to hear more than I have of late the bit about my therapist says this and my therapist says this. And I think partly that is has nothing to do with the fact that it isn't happening. It's more about how I'm managing the conversation. It just because I'm introducing, I have to be careful with it because I absolutely respect other professionals' work, even when it's very different from my own approach. The subtitle of my second book, I'll give the whole title. My second book was "It's Not About Communication: Why Everything You Know About Couples Therapy Is Wrong."
Mm.
And one of the things I point that sounds pretty snarky, doesn't it? One
Yes.
of the things I point out in one of the later chapters in that book is, oh, by the way, that subtitle, everything you know about couples therapy is wrong, that applies to me too. Everything I know about couples therapy is wrong too, which is to say, not that I don't have good ideas, and lots of people have good ideas. People who disagree with me have good ideas. That must be shocking. People who absolutely disagree with me, they have good ideas too. The point is, if we start thinking we know, if we think this is the truth, and that's the phenomenon you're describing. It's like somebody decides, oh, now I have the truth. You're a narcissist. And so that's, you write off anything else about the person. And so that is a danger. Yeah, it does stuff. That's categorization gets weaponized. Again, that's my shtick about hardening of the categories. You know what's interesting? I've noted this with a couple of different things. I've noted it with borderline. That's the borderline personality disorder. And what, in my training, what I learned, nobody taught me, this is my own conclusion, was that, oh, I get it. Borderline is the diagnosis you get when you pissed off your therapist enough. And it's the kind of, it used to be, and maybe this, I hope this is less true than it was. It used to be that if somebody got that diagnosis, they were pretty much considered a hopeless case
Yeah.
by therapists. It's, you can't work with borderlines. That, and I've heard people say that. And then along comes Marsha Linehan and creates dialectical behavior therapy, DBT, which and I'm not trained in it, although I know about it. And it's incredibly respectful of people and teaches skills. And so then I started noticing people would get that diagnosis, which would give them entree into some really good help. And so it was helpful to them. So the same diagnosis could be this millstone around their neck, or it could admit them to some really good help. Another much more common example is ADHD.
Mhm.
Just did this very day. I just did a put up on Substack a rant about ADHD. Now, why am I ranting? I'm not. I hope comes through. I'm not black and white on the subject. I'm not saying, oh, it doesn't exist at all. I
Right.
am observing that it actually was, my little rant was triggered by an article I saw in the New York Times, I think last week, that was talking about how a lot of the eminent researchers in the field are rethinking their assumptions around it. Because they were thinking, one of them, and I don't think this guy ever recanted, I can't think of his name. He referred to ADHD as diabetes of the mind. And
Mm.
he, not literally, but he's saying it's like diabetes. If you don't take your insulin, if you're diabetic needing insulin, you're going to have all these terrible things happen. If you don't take your medication for, if you have or don't have ADHD, you either have it or you don't. It turns out that's bullshit.
Mhm.
And anybody in the real world would have known that just by talking with people. But the folks who studied it were so convinced of the essential reality that it's you either have it or you don't, that they couldn't see the actual experience of people who are dealing with it. So ADHD is another one where I've seen it be really helpful to folks to have summarized a bunch of things that say, oh, there are a lot of people who have that kind of pattern. Here's some handy dandy tricks you can use. And again, it's not like I'm utterly opposed to medication. Sometimes medication seems to help some folks cope in certain circumstances. I do tend to think you do realize it's dangerous medication. It's like it has some pretty nasty side effects. Don't use it. Don't use it without caution.
Right.
But anyway, so there's that. But then there's the use of it that just turns into it's this disability that now, as I say, everybody's neurodivergent now. It's because you have ADHD, so you're neurodivergent, as opposed to, oh, you're good at some stuff and you suck at other stuff, which is not the same way
Like,
of looking at the world.
yeah, yeah. It is life. And I think it goes back to the point of you talking about how society's basically not helping us become resilient. It's doing the opposite, right? Where people becoming more brittle and the smallest form of adversity can be used to make an excuse and give up in a way. That's definitely becoming an issue, which I think brings us to another area that we wanted to explore was this whole notion of, and I think you and I connected on that as well, was this idea of ideas versus ideologies. And then
Hmm.
when you put something under the umbrella of ideology, it just makes it that more challenging to have a conversation about it because we become so rigid in that rather than exploring different ideas and finding different ways of looking at things.
Yeah. Yeah,
What are your thoughts
exactly.
on
That's
that? Yeah.
Yeah, that is in fact the way I use those terms, and not everybody uses them the same way, but the way I distinguish between ideas and ideology, it's very much what you were talking about. Ideas open you up to other ideas. And you hear contrasting ideas or even conflicting ideas, and so that's interesting. Here's my answer to that. What do you think? And there are actually people who are open to hearing what other possibilities are. Ideology, but the way I'm defining it is when it hardens into something that is to be defended rather than to be thought about.
Hmm.
And so when ideas harden into ideologies, you get the phenomenon, and I know you're in Canada. Congratulations on getting through an election where it doesn't seem to have involved attempted coups or anything like that, at
I
least
had,
so far.
yeah, exactly.
But anyway, and speaking as an American, by the way, I think I mentioned when we met before, I went to the University of Toronto. I lived in Canada for several years. So I like Canada. I don't want Canada to be another state. Thank you very much. I like visiting Canada as another country. So you guys stay, you do you. So at least most Americans, I think, would agree with me.
Right.
But in any case, that idea of ideologies, when things harden, that's when you get the sort of tribal polarization that we're experiencing a lot in our politics here,
Yep.
where as soon as you hear somebody say something that sounds like, oh, you're one of them, automatically you know everything about them, which
Yes.
of course is nonsense, and you can't hear anything they say. And you write off everything they say. And so it becomes impossible to actually have a conversation.
Hmm.
So there is an organization which I just love to plug called Braver Angels in the
Yeah.
States, which is all about ways of breaking down that polarization so that people can actually hear each other across the spectrum. And they're not, the neat thing about Braver Angels is they're not pretending there aren't differences. They're not saying, oh, we all believe in the same thing. No, we don't actually. We have considerable differences in approach and what we think are good things to do. There is a lot of common ground if we don't get ideological. And the other thing I like to point out about ideologies, ideology versus ideas, when ideas harden into ideology, it's not only that you can't hear each other, it's that they become caricatures
Hmm.
of the original ideas. Classic example, look at religions, and I'm Jewish and very active. I'm active in my religion, so I'm not opposed to religion. But if you look at religions in general, all the ones I know of say things like people should love each other and be nice to each other and not kill each other and stuff like that. They all seem to say that.
Yeah.
And then you get this phenomenon of, but we have to kill the heretics, right? We have to make sure that the people who are loving God the wrong way, we have to wipe them out because they're somehow dangerous to our ideology. So it's a caricature of
Yes.
the original good ideas. And
Right.
that's what happens with ideology. So again, it comes back to softening the categories. That's
And I think part of it, what I'm observing is also we can become very lazy in our thinking because the brain likes to work in patterns. So
sure.
by having that in group versus out group phenomena, then you can just label someone. And like you said, once you've labeled someone within a group, then you can exactly, okay, this is what this person is. And
Yeah.
then when you look at religion, the in group is bigger, but then you shrink it down to society or even your community. That group can shrink, and that's where a lot of the problem can arise. Not that there aren't problems in religious thinking as well, but that's the nature of the phenomenon that you're trying to explain here, and that's what I'm observing. And it's easier to then keep people on the outside rather than trying to understand what is the view that they're bringing. And part of it,
Yeah.
I think, is because people are so insecure around their own beliefs and ideas, right? If you're confident in your belief or the idea you have, someone else's view should not shake your conviction. And
Or perhaps it will challenge your conviction, but if you're confident in your basic validity, maybe you'll change your mind.
exactly.
That's
That's
a
the beauty of
possibility.
it. When you
Yeah.
expose yourself to it, it just gives you a new way of looking at things and you can expand your horizons rather than staying very narrow or tunnel vision
Yeah.
and basically dismissing anything that doesn't fit your criteria. So I think that's part of the problem that we're seeing. And politically, obviously, both we just went through an election too, but that's the same thing that we were seeing is you're either if you're part of this party, these are the things that you believe in, this is who you are as a
Yeah.
person, you're this and that, rather than trying to understand the person and what their views are and what are they bringing to the table, because the truth is always somewhere in the middle. It's not
Well, and
somewhere on the extremes.
I do want to put in a word, oddly enough,
Yeah.
for the notion of in group and out group, because because that's how we are. That's how we've evolved.
Yes.
We are tribal for
Yes.
good reasons. I'm sure there's an element of this, particularly Jewish perspective in this, because we're small in the grand scheme of things, but very tribal in that sense. And the interesting thing is the existence of a tribe, and again, it's not just Jews. It's like there's lots of small groups of various kinds. Jonathan Haidt, I think, reports some of the research that has been done where people who perceive themselves to be in an in group confidently
Yeah.
tend to be more charitable to members of outgroups than people who think of themselves as just citizens of the world
Mm,
as a group. It's like the phenomenon that, let's say, again speaking in the states, fundamentalist Christians tend to be very charitably oriented, even to non-fundamentalist Christians. Which again, to folks who aren't fundamentalist Christians, it often sounds like, no, they're the ones who are always yelling. No, actually, that's not true. Sometimes they are, but mostly they're a really charitable bunch to people who aren't like them at all, and also in group. So it's just that phenomenon that, yeah, having an in group isn't a terrible thing. Having your own tribe isn't bad. Don't be terrible to other tribes, but recognize it's okay to have tribes. Just don't be assholes about it. That's my general my current rants seem to be along the lines of, rather than preaching about not being assholes, why don't we just not be assholes?
right. Yeah.
Which turns out to be, oddly enough, a very different thing.
Yes.
The constantly having to affirm that we're accepting of everybody is obnoxious as hell. It's funny. I was asking my wife about this. She is also Jewish. I was asking my wife about this. I said, "Do you ever have that experience where somebody shows up in your doorstep? They're proselytizing, one of the proselytizing groups, and so I'll say I'm Jewish, and every once in a while somebody will say that's okay." And I said to my wife, "Does that happen to you?" So she said, "Yes." I said, "How does that make you feel?" She says, "Fuck you."
Yeah.
That's exactly how I feel too. Excuse me, I don't need you to tell me that that's okay. If somebody said to me, "Oh, you're Jewish. Can I try and talk you out of it?"
Mm,
I would probably say no, but I wouldn't feel disrespected. Yes. Oh, they're not up to them to tell me it's okay or not okay. In fact, what they're telling me is it's not okay.
right.
They're saying, "Oh, you're going to go to hell. Bummer, dude. Can I talk you out of it?" And I would say, "Hey, I disagree with your assessment.
Right.
So no, I don't think I'm going to go to hell. I think your religion's wrong about that one. You guys ought to change your mind. So there, but we can agree to disagree. We're fine. That's mutually respectful. This
Yeah.
business that says, oh, we have to be constantly acknowledging how everybody's welcome isn't actually welcoming. What's actually welcoming is actually being welcome. Yeah.
Yes. Yeah. And I've definitely thought about that too, because when you start identifying the differences in people, you're already excluding them in a way, as much as you think in your head that, oh, I'm being so inclusive. Why
Yeah.
are you identifying everyone as being different then? So it
Yeah.
is a tough one to wrap your head around, but
Because that's a given. Lots of people are different.
yes,
That's fine. If it's fine, then relax.
right.
Then when the differences manifest, don't be a jerk about it.
Yeah. And that's the social media phenomenon too, right? Like in line with talking about differences, even people focusing on these are all the ways you shouldn't be. It's get your house in order first. And that's a good starting point. Right. And that could take an entire lifetime when you keep that focus just on yourself. But speaking of like even being Jewish and some of the rhetoric that you see in the world today, where there's so much divide, and again, talking about some of the conflict in the Middle East as well. How have you been able to navigate that for yourself, where there's so much pulling and pushing in one direction or the other? How do you keep grounded with respect to some of that? Speaking of
Yeah.
I- ideologies,
Yeah. Speaking of ideologies, right? Yeah. It isn't easy all the time. It isn't easy. It's particularly after October 7th, it was incredibly difficult. And so, what do people do in that circumstance? I'll tell you what's happened in the Jewish world is this enormous influx of people clustering together. It's, oh my God, I need to talk to other Jewish people about this. And other people too, by the way. But yes, lots of people. There were that people came in from the cold. It's like people who had no affiliation with Jewishness or Jewish organizations or synagogues or whatever were joining or coming together and feeling, oh no, I need to be around some people so I don't feel so at risk and so alone. And that phenomenon makes sense to me too. And of course, to be able to hear how painful this is for everybody on both sides. It's so interesting. I've never had any difficulty understanding, and I don't think I want to get specifically into all the issues in the Middle East, but understanding Palestinian rage against Israelis, I've never had any difficulty understanding. I have a hard time understanding the American left not understanding Israeli pain or Israeli rage, not understanding why people could be extreme on that side too. I have a hard time with that one.
Hmm.
And to me, that says, okay, there's a history of that. It's readily available, just like racism is readily available, even if we're unconscious of it.
Yes.
Readily available that people can see anti Semitism has been around for a very long time and it manifests in some very interesting, horrible, interesting,
Yeah.
characteristic ways. And of course, as a Jew, I'm very aware of that stuff.
Great.
And my non Jewish friends aren't nearly as aware of it. And I wouldn't expect them to be. Why should they be? I'm not aware of racism against people of color.
Yeah.
I'm not subject to that. I try to be sympathetic, but I'm not subject to it. I'm not going to be an expert on it. But anyway, so all of that by way of saying it's hard. But see, that's my little statement and say there's in groups are a useful phenomenon too. Why do women want to get together with just women sometimes? For good reason. Why do
Yeah.
men want to get together with just men sometimes? For good reason. I think the reasons are sometimes somewhat different, but I think those are valid things to do and they
Yeah.
make sense.
Yeah. And I guess to bring it to a close, my struggle has been that this isn't necessarily a religious issue to begin with, but for some reason it's become one. And that's where I tend to struggle. But again, just want to get your thoughts on it because I think the second you try to group it under religion, it becomes so much more complex and it takes the focus away from what is the real issue here. But that's just my thoughts around it.
Yeah. It's complex.
Yeah.
And I guess that's a very general takeaway from all of this stuff. If when a couple comes in, I'll bring it back to couples therapy. When a couple comes in and they're having some kind of really painful problem happening, if they think it's simple, it probably isn't as simple as they think. And again, I don't mean to insist on that, but it's rarely simple. It's usually multi-factored and difficult and sticky. And you know who my wife and I for our podcast we're going to be interviewing a woman named Lauren Hall soon. I don't usually make promissory notes for our podcast because what if it doesn't happen? But
Yeah.
here I am saying this, and I'm putting a little plug for her. I don't know her personally, but I know her through her Substack.
Yeah.
Her shtick is radical moderation, and I love that concept.
Yeah.
Radical moderation. I've often thought of the slogan for radical moderates. What do we want? Moderation. When do we want it? When it's appropriate. It just doesn't quite have that ring to it that you'd want to have in a big demonstration, but it's it is a really interesting kind of concept.
And
And I think that has a lot to do with understanding personal issues, political issues, global issues. It's really all about that sense of, yeah, it tends to be more complex than we are inclined to
yeah,
want to read it as.
for sure. No, I appreciate that. Bruce, thank you so much for coming on here and sharing so much of your wisdom and experience with us. And since you did plug in the podcast, I'll encourage you to share how people can find you online, whether it is your show or your books or your Substack. Please feel free to share all of those ways. And then we
Yep.
will obviously put all of it in the show notes as well.
Great. Yeah, the easiest way to find out about pretty much all of my stuff is just go to brucechalmer.com. So if you spell my name, you'll get it, brucechalmer.com. And you have information about my practice, which I do all by telehealth, and also information about my books, and that'll point you to the podcast. We do have a podcast website. The name of the podcast, again, is Couples Therapy in 7 words. So the podcast website is CT in 7, that's the number 7, ctn7.com. That'll get you there, and you can see and hear our episodes. And yeah, books. If you go to brucechalmer.com, all that information is there.
All right. Thank you again, Bruce. We'll definitely share all of that. And I appreciate your time today.
Thank you so much. Thanks for having me on.